An American diplomatic compound in Benghazi was overrun and set on fire in September 2012, and militants launched a devastating mortar barrage on the CIA base. Esam Omran AlFetoriReuters Washington, after armed men stormed the American diplomatic mission and assaulted a CIA base in Benghazi, Libya. In 2012, the United States turned to a Libyan to help gather information about Ahmed Abu Khatallah, a prime suspect in the deadly attacks. The soft-spoken informant befriended Mr. Khatallah and began visiting his house in Benghazi. He gave Mr. Khatallah money, a vehicle and computers, pleasing Mr. Khatallah, who eventually began confiding in the man. The 40-year-old informant testified matter-of-factly for hours in federal court in Washington on Monday and Tuesday under the pseudonym of Ali Majrizi. He implicated Mr. Khatallah in the attacks that killed 4 Americans, including Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens, and spoke of his initial reservations about working with the United States, which eventually paid him a $7 million reward for his work. "There was a lot of dangers in that thing. It was really a hard decision to make," he said, explaining that he wanted to help his home city of Benghazi. The informant's testimony, given through an interpreter, marked the beginning of the 6th week of the trial of Mr. Khatallah, 46, who is accused of helping orchestrate the September 11, 2012, attacks in Benghazi. The diplomatic mission was overrun and set on fire, and militants launched a devastating mortar barrage on the CIA base. If convicted, Mr. Khatallah faces life in prison. Already, a jury has heard dramatic accounts from CIA officers in disguises and other Americans who survived the attacks. 2 other Libyans also provided damaging details about Mr. Khatallah as federal prosecutors tried to paint in a damning picture of his activities before and after the attacks. In his lengthy testimony, Mr. Majrizi talked about how the Americans paid him $5,000 a month to spy on Mr. Khatallah and arrange his capture at a seaside cottage about 20 miles southwest of Benghazi. Once Mr. Khatallah was in American custody, Mr. Majrizi received a hefty reward, paid in 2 installments, and was relocated to Texas. He received other compensation from the FBI too, paying for his family's expenses. Mr. Khatallah's defense lawyer, Michelle Peterson, suggested Mr. Majrizi's testimony was financially motivated. "It's hard to keep track of all the money the U.S. government was paying you, wasn't it?" she said. He said it was hard to remember because the events he recounted moved rapidly. Ms. Peterson's cross-examination seemed to frustrate the informant at times on Tuesday. Mr. Majrizi provided a pivotal piece of the prosecution's case. He linked the Benghazi attackers to Mr. Khatallah. As prosecutors played surveillance footage of the attack on the diplomatic compound, Mr. Majrizi identified a number of men and said 3 were very close to Mr. Khatallah. The informant said the men were part of a hit squad that carried out killings on Mr. Khatallah's behalf. The informant said Mr. Khatallah himself could also be seen on surveillance video minutes after the attack began and later at the door of the diplomatic mission, holding an AK-47 assault rifle. Ms. Peterson asked the informant whether he had special training when it came to recognizing faces on grainy video. He responded he had a very strong memory. Later, Mr. Khatallah began sharing incriminating information as the informant gained his trust. He even once showed the informant documents and computers, suggesting the materials had been taken from the diplomatic mission and that he knew the names of Libyans who had visited the American ambassador. On another occasion, Mr. Khatallah showed Mr. Majrizi a mortar and shells he kept in his garage. Mr. Khatallah told the informant he was expert in the use of mortars and bragged about his ability to hit targets even under the most difficult circumstances. A mortar was used to attack the CIA base after the diplomatic compound had been overrun, its fire killing 2 CIA contractors and wounding 2 other Americans. Mr. Khatallah also spoke of his plans in the attacks, making reference to an American rescue force that had been delayed at the Benghazi airport after arriving from Tripoli. "I intended then to kill everyone there, even those who were at the airport," Mr. Majrizi recalled Mr. Khatallah saying. During his testimony, the informant said Mr. Khatallah told him the Americans were using a facility to spy on people in Benghazi, a possible reference to the base the CIA had been using. Mr. Khatallah suspected the American government was seeking to arrest him, according to the informant. He testified that Mr. Khattala told a group of militants at a mosque in Benghazi that he was wanted by the Americans. Mr. Majrizi said that after the capture of an al-Qaeda suspect in October 2013 in Tripoli, Mr. Khattala became paranoid, rarely leaving his house. When he did, he traveled with a group of men for safety reasons. He often changed his phone number and the vehicles in which he traveled. The informant also said that Mr. Khattala was close to Mustafa al-Imam, who was apprehended late last month in Libya as a suspect in the Benghazi attacks. Mr. Majrizi said Mr. Khattala and Mr. Imam had been imprisoned together in Libya and that Mr. Imam was frequently at Mr. Khattala's house. He repeatedly identified Mr. Imam on the surveillance video from the attack. Mr. Majrizi said he began working in Libya with the Americans at the end of 2012, lasting until Mr. Khattala was apprehended in June 2014. Ms. Peterson said Mr. Majrizi's American contacts worked for the Defense Department. Former American officials familiar with the operation said that operatives from the military's Joint Special Operations Command debriefed the informant, instead of FBI agents. Mr. Majrizi said he met with his American handlers every 4 months. His secret work, Mr. Majrizi said, was not without risks. He worried about his life. And he had frustrations with the pace of the operation. It took too long, he said. It wore me out, and accompanying him put me under suspicion. The informant suggested killing Mr. Khattala himself, so I can be at rest finally and my city would be at rest, because this person is a murderer, but that did not happen. Finally, the Americans designed an operation to capture Mr. Khattala. It was a comprehensive plan, Mr. Majrizi said. The informant said that the Americans bought a house on the coast, a place where Mr. Khattala would feel safe from rival forces headed by a former CIA asset. One night, Mr. Majrizi drove Mr. Khattala to the cottage, where members of the Army's Delta Force and an FBI agent with the hostage rescue team were waiting. The Americans detained Mr. Khattala while Mr. Majrizi went back to his car. He slept for hours. He later drove to Tripoli and met with American officials who gave him money. He then made his way to Tunisia and eventually, with the help of the FBI, he moved to United States with his family. On Twitter, follow Adam Goldman at Adam Goldman.